video we'll be presenting on the topic of how money supply and inflation impacts the country's economic growth. Before we get into the details, the research data for Vietnam and China were used from 2012 until 2016. For your information, the amount of money in circulation significantly impacts inflation, and if it goes higher than economic growth, which causes purchasing power to decline as prices rise, then inflation may also increase. Besides, the author undertakes empirical studies to analyze how monetary policy affects the two countries' consumer price index and gross domestic product to determine the different impact of the monetary policy. In a microeconomy, the equation of exchange can be formulated as follows, where M is the money supply, P times Y is the total amount spent on goods and services, and P is the level of price, Y is the income. Furthermore, the author also uses correlation coefficient tools. Do you know what correlation coefficient tools are? It is a statistical measure that calculates the strength of the relationship between the relative movements of the two variables of inflation and money supply, and to evaluate the connection between them. A substantial relationship between the variables can also be found using analysis of variance.
Now, moving on to the issue in the article, inflation in an economy originates from an unceasing surge of money supply. In other words, it means that inflation occurs when the supply of money in an economy is growing at a more rapid rate than the economy's ability to produce goods and services. Now, I will further unravel the matter of excessive money supply inducing inflation in an economy by breaking down the equation of exchange, MV equals to PQ, generated under Fisher's quantity theory of demand. So, what is it precisely? Well, the equation of exchange encompasses the link between money supply and the total amount of spending on final goods and services produced in an economy. In this context, MV represents total amount of money spent by buyers, and PQ represents the total amount received by sellers. So, we can conclude that it is evident for one side of the equation to be equivalent to the other. Now, under the same theory of money demand, the equation of the quantity theory of money tells us that V and Q are fairly constant in the short run. Thus, if the money supply increases and is accompanied with a fixed velocity and quantity of goods and services produced, the price level must increase as well. We call this inflation. The diagram here indicates that an increase in money supply leads to an increase in aggregate demand. However, with the aggregate output being constant, it will only result in inflation as the price level moves from P1 to P2. Henceforth, how does inflation impact economic growth? Inflation impacts the real interest rate, real income, and national debt, which then disrupts economic growth. How so? In some cases where the nominal interest rate increases along with the inflation, companies will limit the sizes of their businesses, which then contribute to a rise in unemployment. Moreover, when inflation increases, the real income of workers will decrease, which then decreases their purchasing power. Finally, foreign debt of a country will increase as the inflation rate increases. This is due to the fact that a country with high inflation will cause the home currency to depreciate against foreign currencies of lower inflation rate as its exchange rate escalates.
Next, we would like to propose some recommendations that can be used in coping with inflation. First of all, the money supply must be computed in accordance with the aims of the gross domestic product (GDP) growth and inflation targets. So, to understand more about inflation targets, the central bank usually depends on an overnight nominal interest rate. When inflation is high, their practice is to raise the nominal interest rate target relative to the inflation target. So the question here is why a rise in interest rates will have an impact on reducing spending, thus cooling an overheated economy, and this will reduce inflation. Moreover, nominal GDP targets work well considering if productivity drops. In order to use inflation targets, the central bank should tighten policy due to the rise in inflation. Following the nominal GDP targets, a central bank might merge the increase in inflation with the drop down in real GDP and not tighten policy, or may even loosen policy if the expected fall in real GDP is bigger than the expected increase in inflation. As a result, the demand for money can be estimated to make sure the money supply is in advisable quantity, which prevents excess in the money supply.
Moving on to the next recommendation, which is to use different tools to regulate the money supply. So, I will explain about 3 initiatives done by the central bank to control the money supply and maintain a strong economic growth. First and foremost, the reserve requirement is defined as a sum of money trading banks that need to hold at the bank. So, when there is a low reserve requirement, banks will hold money less as their reserve, which then allows the bank to make more loans. Meanwhile, a high reserve requirement limits the amount of money a bank can lend to borrowers, as the bank would need to hold more money as their reserve. For example, with the implementation of contractionary monetary policy during inflation, the central bank will set a high reserve ratio by increasing interest rate, which will discourage lending. Thus, money supply and aggregate demand will decrease. Therefore, inflation can be defeated. Moreover, open market operation refers to the central bank buying and selling securities in the financial market. When the central bank buys securities, it raises the cash in the bank's reserve account and their available credit. On the other hand, when the central bank sells securities, it records on the bank's balance sheet and diminishes its cash holdings, leaving the banks with fewer amount of money to lend. Therefore, during inflation, banks will sell more treasury bills by raising interest rates. Thus, money supply and aggregate demand will decrease. Then, inflation can be overcome. The last monetary policy instrument is discount rates. This refers to the rediscount rate of exchange and treasury bills. In other terms, it is the interest rate charged by the central bank on commercial banks as well as other financial institutions when making loans. On the account, as contractionary monetary policy is implemented during inflation, the central bank will increase the interest rate on loans, which result in discouragement on borrowing. Thus, money supply and aggregate demand will decrease. And finally, inflation can be conquered.
The final suggestion is to enhance the efficiency of capital investment in the economy. Incremental capital output ratio (ICOR). The additional capital needed to add 1 unit of output can be computed by an annual investment over GDP's annual rise. In addition, ICOR can be said to measure the productivity level of capital investment. A high ICOR refers to inefficiency, in which a higher investment level is required to generate 1 extra unit of GDP. Thus, it is suggested to have a lower ICOR as it refers to more efficiency in the country's production. To refine the efficiency of capital investment, the balance between the velocity of money and GDP growth is viewed as a long-run solution to reduce the stress on the money supply, which leads to the rise in the price of goods and also services.
For the conclusion, we can see that inflation has a real impact on the economic growth of the country. When the purchasing power starts to decline as price rise, inflation will occur. Inflation also will impact the interest rate and cost of the imported goods increase as the currency depreciates against foreign currency. For example, in 2012, when money growth in China and Vietnam was strong, the inflation rate rose as well, and vice versa. The money supply has also given rise to inflation, which impacts economic growth. When an economic's money supply is expanding more quickly than its capacity to create products and services, the general price level of commodities and services will rise. The real interest rate, real income and national debt accompanied with high inflation will be the consequence of an economic downturn. We have suggested a few recommendations to lower inflation rate and address the ongoing issue of an excessively high money supply. First, the money supply needs to be computed accordingly using the goals of gross domestic products, GDP growth and inflation targets. Second, the government should use different tools including reserve requirement, discount rate and open market operation to control the money supply and maintain strong economic growth. Lastly, improve the efficiency of capital investment.